fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Several shots were fired as President Kennedy's motorcade passed through downtown Dallas.
None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream. My 4 little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Welcome to the Hagmann Daily Show, weekdays 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And now your hosts, Joe Hagmann and Jon Robberson.
Hello and welcome to this Tuesday, March 27th, 2018 edition of the Hagmann Daily Show. So happy to be here today. Got to apologize for not having a show yesterday. That was my fault. But we got a great show planned for you today. We got a lot to get into, and we're going to cover as much as we can. We have stories from the news on the Chinese satellite that is making its way back to Earth in a fiery crash, and we're going to talk about some of the language that is used in these articles as they call it, I think it was heaven falling, or the name of the Chinese ship, the, I can't even pronounce this Tiangong ship, is set to unleash a series of fireballs before crashing back to the Earth's surface. Now, the name of this ship is, let's see, where is it here? I just said it. The Tiangong, or Heavenly Place, is expected to fall back to Earth between March 30th and April 2nd. Most of the 8-ton space probe that was launched in 2011 should burn up in the atmosphere before making a crash landing. Now, they don't know where exactly it's going to crash, and we have been, there's a website, it's called satflare.com, where you can follow this space station that is re-entering, and they say that the Chinese space station Tiangong 1, or Heavenly Place, has been declared out of control by the Chinese authorities and will re-enter the atmosphere in the coming days. And it's a very interesting, all eyes on the sky, and the right now it's over Vietnam, but nobody knows where it will crash, and that's the article on Drudge. It talks about what is in the path of this space station, where it could come back in, and they say anything from from the north 43 degree latitude mark to south 43 degree latitude mark, which basically encompasses most of the civilized world, is in the danger zone, from Italy to Russia to even America, New Zealand, and Japan, and others. So it's going to be interesting, John. Hopefully this thing comes back in, falls into the ocean with no other problems. But there's a very real possibility that this thing could crash over land. And if it does, hopefully it's not in a populated area.
Well, indeed. Taking a look at the news cycle today, and I'm focusing particularly, Joe, right out of the gate on this piece at thehill.com. One has to ask oneself, what's going to crash first, the twice happiness heavenly space station, or the new Chinese hypersonic missiles? Russia, China eclipse U.S. in hypersonic missiles, prompting fears. Now, Joe, we know that both myself and Dr. Peter Vincent Pry wrote articles about this, I guess about 2 weeks ago now, shortly after President Putin's braggadocious State of the Union address in Moscow. And this is what strikes me about this article, Joe, is that our own Department of Defense is admitting, as are our legislators, that we've been outgunned by the Chinese and the Russians. Now, I know you've got an opinion on this, and I'll encourage you to share that momentarily, but this is a direct quote from Senator James Inhofe, Republican of Oklahoma. Quote, "Right now we're helpless. Senator James Inhofe, Republican, Oklahoma, a senior member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, said in advocating for more investment in hypersonics, along with missile defense. Now, it's important to note, Joe, that hypersonics are generally defined as missiles that can fly more than 5 times the speed of sound. I'll give you one more piece of this. General John Hyten, commander of U.S. Strategic Command, STRATCOM, last week described a hypersonic as a missile that starts out, quote, like a ballistic missile, but then it depresses the trajectory and then flies more like a cruise missile or an airplane. So it goes up into the low reaches of space, and then turns immediately back down and then levels out at a very high level of speed. And then the other real takeaway piece from this article, and Joe, I'll hand it back to you, is but in congressional testimony last week, Hyten conceded U.S. missile defense cannot stop hypersonics. Now, again, this is the general in charge of STRATCOM. He said that the U.S. is instead relying on nuclear deterrence or the threat of a retaliatory U.S. strike as its defense against such missiles. Joe, what do you think?
Well, John, we were talking about this before the show and yesterday about the increased capabilities of countries like China and Russia and what they've been able to do as far as technologically developing an arsenal that some say is more advanced than what the United States has. But I'll just say this, and I'm sure many people will agree with this, but the United States, I believe, and the powers of the world more so, much like what we saw with the atomic bomb, and I do believe this is the case also with space and space travel, is that we have much more advanced technology and weapon systems, much more so than what even the human mind would consider to be available. And whether these things would be used in a war or not, I don't know, but I believe I believe space is weaponized, and I believe the United States is in the forefront of that. But would that ever be admitted and or talked about? No, I don't believe that would happen. But what is being reported and what we've been talking about is this push, this Russian push to continue to increase their defense, especially in the face of the encroaching NATO, the problems with Ukraine, and what we have seen with this ramping up in Syria. Now, if and when there's a World War III, is it going to be fought with nuclear weapons? Is it going to be something with technologies that we don't even and are not aware of yet? Many people and John, you'll remember this, during the California wildfires, many people were talking about space-based direct energy weapons. And I believe that, that is a real technology and a real...
I do too.
Yeah. So the dynamics of what we know as far as what we have, what's on the books versus all the other stuff that's going on. And people might think I'm crazy for believing this, but I do believe that basically we have the final frontier, outer space. I believe there's much more going on out there involving the United States and other countries. I think they have attempted to master space travel, and they might have been able to do it, but we don't know. But when we talked before the show, John, about the stories like this, mysterious cloud spotted over Arizona, California, and Mexico. Pilots report seeing UFOs. Now think about this satellite reentry that's going to crash back down to Earth. Obviously, since we have a worldwide media through the internet and information sharing, we all understand who've been paying attention when this thing crashes back down what it is. But imagine this. Imagine that somebody perceived that was a weapon that was used against them, which could start a war if it hit a city or whatever. But I think it's interesting and maybe prophetic that this satellite coming back down to Earth is called Heavenly Place.
Oh, absolutely.
First of all. And then in the midst of all this, we see the tensions in Syria and the international tensions continue to rise. And it's almost like a foreshadowing with this satellite coming back down. And maybe I'm being cynical, but it's almost like a foreshadowing to something that could be coming in the near future.
I think you're actually being fairly. I think you're exercising a little bit of literary license today. It very well could be foreshadowing, and if our listeners choose to do a search on the, I guess, unidentified cloud or cloud structure all over the southwest of the United States yesterday, as reported in places as far as Tempe to San Diego.
Yeah, I want to talk about this briefly too.
It looks, I'm going to hand it back to you momentarily. It looks almost like the artist's renderings that you see, and I've used these as the featured image on Hagmann Report a couple times over the past year or two, of what an EMP test is perceived to look like. And we know that North Korea has satellites orbiting our country every day. We know that China's got all kinds of space-based technology, or what they sometimes call in the SOCOM community non-breathable technology, which is one of their little nomenclatures for something above the atmosphere. And Joe, I just want to put a fine point quickly on the reportage on the remarks that President Putin made in the Kremlin, and we can move on from there. But as a shameless plug, back on March 9th, I posted an article at Hagmann Report, Russia applauds nuking Florida and Hillary Clinton paid for it. Now, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but I would encourage our listeners to go back to HagmannReport.com, pull up this article, again posted March 9th, 2018. There's an interesting secondary story, if you will, about Skolkovo and Hillary Clinton and her Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, actually conspiring with a number of non-tax-paying U.S. corporations, think Deep State, Boeing, General Electric, Cisco, etc., who funded this innovation center in Moscow that is in part responsible for the necessary innovations to bring about these hypersonic missiles. Now, again, just to kind of put a punctuation mark on all of this, we then brought in a show the following day that's titled Weaponized Russia, What the Mainstream Media is Not Telling Us. And we featured on that program a half hour with former CIA analyst Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, who wrote a beautifully complimentary article to my piece about the specific weapon systems, their capabilities, etc. Again, this out of the Russian arsenal. And that article is linked in my article that I mentioned a moment ago. And the last thing I'd like to say about all of this, Joe, is with regard to your commentary as far as what's going on in space, how much do we as the taxpayers, as the people writing the checks for all of this, what do we know versus what's really going on? I've always suspected that we probably know 10% or less, and this may seem a little bit out of left field, but some of our listeners will go and do this, and I think they'll be very surprised when they do. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, Joe, for some reason I did a search on the different – I remember what it was. I saw a convoy in California going down the 210 westbound. I saw a convoy of military vehicles, and I saw the insignia on their left arm patches, and I wanted to know what unit it was that was convoying down the road. This is just right before I left L.A. That's what I was doing. And I looked up insignias for our different armed services, and of course there's hundreds of them across the four major armed services. But, Joe, I didn't even hardly know at that point that there is a Space Command. It's part of the United States Air Force. And if you look at these different insignia, from the Office of Naval Intelligence to Space Command and many, many others, they are rife with Illuminati and Luciferian symbolism. I mean, if you've got even just a tad bit of instruction on symbology, when you look at these insignia, it's really disheartening because right on their arm patches, our armed services are wearing the same kind of Illuminati, pyramidic, all-seeing eye of Lucifer type symbolism that's all over our dollar bill.
Yeah, and John, that's we should do a show on the New World Order and the New World Order symbolism and infiltration into so much of our culture today, because and this is kind of out of left field, but we have the Occupy conference.
Joe, I'm going to write that down. We do need to do that show. But go ahead, brother.
We have the Occupy conference coming up, and this has my mental wheels turning and my research going 1,000 miles an hour as I have been. I don't know what I'm going to talk about yet on our presentation. and I want to do something that is very relevant. And I've been writing a lot more, and I've been gathering information on a whole host of different subjects. And one of the things that I was looking at, John, is something a guest of ours on Hagmann Report said yesterday about this paper, Connectivity, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization, and the New World Order and their plans, and how that ties in, and how their plans mirror and tie into Bible prophecy. Is worthy of a whole show in itself. But in this research, trying to understand the ideology of the left, trying to understand the motivations, what they want and how they want to go about getting it, I've come across a very interesting piece on the Constitution by a Mr. Terry Moe. And this is really, you want some insight into the mind of these liberal, anti-American traders. Look no further than this guy, who has written many pieces talking about our outdated Constitution. And now we're going to, I just want to cover some of this, what he says a little bit, because it's very eye-opening. And this guy, he is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. But what he wrote, his latest piece on the Constitution, America's Outdated Constitution, and what he talks about in this article is the founding document of the United States is unsuited for a modern society, which is, it's crazy when you read what he goes on to say. For more than a year, Donald Trump has warned Americans that their political system was rigged to subvert the will of the people. When the votes were counted on Election Day, the outcome did indeed subvert the will of the people, but hardly in the way Trump envisioned. Hillary Clinton won almost 3 million more votes than Trump did, beating him by a margin of 2.1%, yet Trump was elected president. How could such a thing happen? The answer lies in the Electoral College, a grossly undemocratic provision of the American Constitution. And then he goes on to cite the Constitution. But anyways, he takes to task the Electoral College, and he also goes on to say that the Constitution and the entire structure of government that is wholly unsuited to modern times operates like a straitjacket. And he goes on to say that in his recent book, Relic, he explains how the Constitution undermines the prospects for effective government in America. He is saying, keep
talking, Joe. I'm reloading.
The Constitution of the United States of America is undermining our government's ability to function. And then he goes on from there, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. He says that any notion that American government functioned wonderfully in the good old days is pure fantasy. The fact is, the good old days were not good. And what he's talking about is how the founders crafted a government over 200 years ago. And what he says is, this was a different time. There was only 4 million people in this country, and there were slaves at the time. And basically, they only the Constitution should only apply to their time period. And then, I have so much in this article. After I read this, John, I spent some time last night copying and pasting and writing some commentary on this. And he goes on also to say that the founding fathers never anticipated that the government was they never anticipated that the country was going to last this long. And with the advancements of modern technology, from the internet to technology as far as transportation, that the founders never could have envisioned their Constitution actually still applying in this globalized world. And he goes on to cite the progressive movement and he goes on to talk about how we need, for the social good of this country, to remove the Constitution. He calls it primitive, and says that the only promising path forward, it says the United States is not going to shift to a parliamentary system, and other radical reforms are off the table too. That being so, a practical strategy under the circumstances is to seek out small constitutional changes, which would have big payoffs for an effective government. And he goes on to say, talking about removing amendments and changing laws. And this whole, I'm going to do a big write-up on this. I should open the paper that I've been writing to give you my commentary and to talk about the very interesting pieces in here that just caught my attention. But this led me down a road, John, to where I was doing a lot of reading on different mindsets and different people's opinions, from the Second Amendment to the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution in general. And when we look at what was set up and established through our founding fathers as the founding document of America, we look today at how perverted that has, how much that has been perverted, from the banking systems and implementing a foreign bank as our financial system. That was basically one of the main reasons we declared independence from Britain. So we've already, I guess you could say, tossed out some of the Constitution already. But are we on the verge of seeing the Constitution at some point in time in the future, completely gutted and no longer will be the document of American law? I don't want to live in an America that doesn't have our constitutional freedoms that are guaranteed. I know you don't either. This is what they want.
Yeah, go ahead and finish. I'm sorry, finish your thought, Joe. I'm squirming in my chair. Please go ahead and finish.
This is what they want. These people, whether actually being able to ban the Constitution or to get it tossed out and replacing it with something else, or making it so they change the laws so incrementally that the Constitution becomes null and void anyway. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. The TSA. We see that the TSA completely violates the Fourth Amendment, our Fourth Amendment rights. But how can that be when we live in this country that has a constitution? Well, it is because they took advantage, much like what the students in Parkland are doing. They took advantage of a crisis in order to play off people's fears, to expand their power and authority, trampling on our constitutional rights. And much like Parkland, this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to have an emotional, tyrannical response to the latest shooting. Now, last on the Constitution is what this author says. They believe that the Constitution undermines our government, as I said. And he goes on to say, the real problem rests with the core components of government that, as the Constitution designated them, are responsible for making the nation's laws. And this author has a long history of writing articles like this. His body of work that I'm looking at right now, America's Antiquated Constitution. Is the Constitution out of date? Conservatives and the Constitution. Our outdated Constitution. This is basically what he speaks on. But this provides us insight into the mentality of the people with this liberal ideology. Now, the ideology of the left and their agenda is much like Islam. They want total submission to their belief system, which is this Marxist, anti-Christian, anti-American globalist mindset. And it is just amazing to see how far we have come and how many people buy into this, globalist mindset. And I guess when I say globalist, I'm talking about the New World Order, progressive agenda, and people who follow those agenda, which also encapsulates, the satanic and evil elements as well. And no system of government is perfect, but we have seen the American system of government help this people prosper more so than any other legislative document in history. Now, there's another article, which from reading the article on that Constitution led me to another one. Liberals are set on a collision course with democracy. And this article, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it talks about the war that's been brewing over the last 50 years, the cultural and legislative war, and how the author says this: liberals in developed countries have been used to winning almost every argument for economic and cultural openness over the past 30 years, and they have not, in the main, been reacting calmly to the apparent end of this golden era. And it goes and talks about the President Trump, and the people and populist mindset behind President Trump and what he represents, and how these liberals are attempting to destroy not only the president but those who follow the president. And he goes on to talk about how this is an attack at the democratic level, at the psychological level. He talks about the technocrats and the tech companies and how they are indeed part of this huge push to basically bring us into a global world. But anyway, so I don't know why I said all this, but I've been doing a lot of reading and research, and this is what I've been looking at the last few hours.
Well, heads up to all of our listeners that are sitting out in the bleachers here this afternoon, because I'm about to send a very hard baseball your way. First of all, let's go back to the absolute fundamental basics. First President of the United States, George Washington, and he said, and I quote, "Government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Never for a moment should it be left to irresponsible action." Now, Joe, as you've been speaking for the last several minutes, I've been sort of circling a rope around your commentary, and I'm about to cinch it up pretty tight here, because what we're dealing with, as you said, is a setup by the progressive relativists. And I want to emphasize a terminology that we've heard many times over the years, but maybe not enough lately: moral relativism. The first article that you were commenting on, Joe, is moral relativism at its finest. That's quintessential moral relativism. And as you very aptly noted, as demonstrated most recently by the Parkland student survivors, victims, protesters, advocates, and rock stars who went out into Washington, D.C. 3 days ago and screamed for the absolute abandonment of 10, 20, 30 million Americans' rights under the Second Amendment to keep and bear arms that shall not be infringed, but then turned around and kind of snivelly, snot-nosed quipped about how it's not fair that they have to wear translucent backpacks because, my goodness, if there's a young lady going through her reproductive cycle, then it would be very embarrassing for her tampons to be on display.
Oh, my gosh.
So
that's hypocrisy.
It's hypocrisy. It's now, to be fair, these kids are 17 and 18 years old, and they've been paraded out by Hollywood reprobates like Dina Katz, producer of Dancing with the Stars, and many others. And, of course, we had Laura Loomer on last night on the Hagmann Report, who commented on this as well. They've been set up as convenient puppets, and to one degree or another, even convenient dupes. But, Joe, let's take a moment and unpack some of the buildup, as you, again, so aptly laid it out, of this question of the consistent liberal incremental push in perpetuity. They never stop. They never relent.
Nope.
You give them an inch, they'll take a mile. You give them your 30-round magazine, they want the 10-round magazine. And this is a fact, and this is not my opinion. This is provable, just as you said, Joe, through the last 50 years of political history in this country. Now, this is from projectsyndicate.org, and you and I discussed this briefly last night. Richard N. Haas, globalist extraordinaire and head of the Council on Foreign Relations, he wrote this just a couple of days ago, March 21st, 2018, titled "Liberal World Order, RIP." America's decision to abandon the global system it helped build and then preserve for more than 7 decades marks a turning point because others lack either the interest or the means to sustain it. The result will be a world that is less free, less prosperous, and less peaceful for Americans and others alike. Now, again, do your homework. Richard Haas is, if he had his druthers, and again, he's in a very powerful position, he would have us living under a top-down globalist stranglehold of control tomorrow. You wouldn't be able to go to the bathroom and relieve yourself without a government voucher for 1 gallon of toilet water. So that's who Richard Haas is. And he's complaining, again, at projectsyndicate.org, and I believe they reposted this, complaining that the liberal world order is RIP. But perhaps closer to the campfire, Joe, and this is one that's really bothered me the last couple days. Let's start with an article that is penned by Ron Paul, presidential candidate 2008-2012. This is from ronpaulinstitute.org. Neocons are back with a big war budget, big war plans. And of course, rightfully so, Dr. Ron Paul notes at the outset of the article, on Friday, President Trump signed the Omnibus Spending Bill for 2018. The $1.3 trillion bill was so monstrous that it would have made the biggest spender in the Obama administration blush. The image of leading congressional Democrats, Pelosi and Schumer, grinning and gloating over getting everything they wanted, and then some, will likely come back to haunt Republicans at the midterm elections. If so, they will deserve it. Even President Trump admitted the bill was horrible. As he said in the signing ceremony, quote, "There are a lot of things that we shouldn't have had in this bill, but we were, in a sense, forced if we want to build our military," end quote. 2 more points, Joe, and I'll hand it back to you. The first is the president has, since his days as a candidate, has pounded the table for increased military spending. And there's a political component to that, but there's also perhaps a geopolitical component. The political component is that for every congressperson, be they a D or R, that has any form of the military-industrial complex in their district, or military bases or secondary and tertiary suppliers of the military, perhaps not the biggies like General Electric or Boeing, but maybe somebody, for example, who makes the bootlaces for soldiers' footwear, etc. For all of those Congress people, that buys the president political capital. Now, I'd like to mention as a quick side note that it was in 2011 when we were first introduced to NDAA. And for our new listeners, if you're not familiar with that, you need to stop, pause this show, and type into a search engine capital NDAA, because that's the day the music died. That was the beginning of, Joe, as you said, the end of our constitutional republic that did nothing short of declare America, continental United States, as a battle space and give authorities the unlawful authority to detain Americans under suspicion and nothing more. It eliminates the writ of habeas corpus, and it throws the Fourth Amendment completely out the window. Now, one more point. I said there's a political component, but there may be a geopolitical component as well. My concern, Joe, as I listen to President Trump, not his finest moment, sign this bill and then make sorry, President, but make excuses about it. Why are we rebuilding the military with such fervor? And I want to tie this in quickly to my primary gripe. And Joe, this is where I was heading a moment ago. This nomination of John Bolton. Okay, many of our listeners are at least as old as I am, perhaps a few years further down the road. Joe, John Bolton is a neocon in capital neon letters. And he comes out of the George W. Bush camp. He was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, who, by the way, wrote the playbook that Nikki Haley is reading verbatim out of every time we see her in the General Assembly, essentially banging on the table, threatening military action, ostensibly to democratize the planet. But you and I both know, going back to Richard Haass's article, Richard Haass says, America's decision to abandon the global system it helped build and then preserve for more than 7 decades. Now, why does Haass choose 7 decades as opposed to maybe 10 decades going back to the Federal Reserve, or 5 decades going to the Kennedy-Khrushchev era? Why does he choose 7 decades? Because that's the end of World War II, when what happened? When Bretton Woods shifted the global economy from the British pound sterling to the U.S. dollar. And then, of course, 3 decades later, we had Kissinger and Nixon cook up the petrodollar scheme. What's really happening here, Joe, is a tug of war between the globalists and the new populist nationalists, as represented ostensibly by President Donald Trump. And it's a tug of war for who's going to control the global economy. Now, when we see a rogue character like John Bolton come into the President Trump administration, that raises my hackles, because he is a walrus mustachioed neocon, and he's a war hawk. And at the end of the day, his solution to everything is project military power in an undeclared war fashion. And I, Jon Robberson Jr., am 100% against it. Joe?
Well, absolutely. And to just summarize everything that we've been talking about it, at least since I threw forth some of the reading and research I've been doing into, what these people believe. And as you said earlier, John, these globalists are driven by something, I would say, supernatural, because they do never stop. They're constantly encroaching with their agenda, and they are, there's never, it's like the scripture says, what the scripture says about Leviathan. And let me grab my Bible here, because this is so important while I'm thinking about it. In Job, we get a picture of what this Leviathan is and what it looks like. And let me get my Bible open to Job, because it gives in this
catch.
I guess
Nice catch.
It describes perfectly. Here, let me just do a search online, because I have a huge Bible in front of me, and it's going to take me forever to find what I'm looking for. But Leviathan is talked about many times in the Old Testament. And what is so interesting about this, here we go, Job 41. Now let me just set this to the King James Version. And this is so interesting because, again, this summarizes exactly what you're talking about, John. It summarizes how what the mindset, what the attack, how these people attack, and what they are like. And this sums it up perfectly. Can thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Can thou put a hook into his nose, or bore a jaw with a thorn? Will he make any supplication unto thee? Will he make a covenant with thee? And I'm going to skip here to what's important here. It talks about, can anybody lay a hand upon him? Lay thy hand upon him. Remember the battle. Do no more. Behold, the hope of him is in vain. Shall not one be cast down, even at the sight of him? None is so fierce that dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand before me? Who hath prevented me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. I will not conceal his parts, nor his power, nor his comely proportion. Who can discover the face of his garment? Who can come to him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors to his face? His teeth are terrible round about. His scales are his pride, shut up together as with a close seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be sundered. And it goes on to describe from there. It says, his eyes are like the eyelids of morning. Out of his mouth burning lamps, sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils smoke like a seething pot or cauldron. His neck remaineth his strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him. His flakes and of his flesh are joined together. They are firm in themselves, they cannot be moved. His heart is as firm as stone, as hard as a piece of another millstone. When he raiseth himself up, the mighty are afraid. By reason of thy breakings they purify themselves. The sword of him that layeth cannot hold, the spear, the dart, nor the habergeon. The esteemed iron as straw, the brass as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Slingstones are turned with him into stubble. Darts are counted as stubble. He laugheth at the shaking of a spear. Sharp stones are under him. He spreadeth sharp pointing things upon the mire. He maketh the deep to boil like a pot. He maketh the sea like a pot of ointment. He make a path to shine after him. One would think the deep to be hoary. Upon the earth there is none his like, who is made without fear. And it ends by saying, he beholdeth all high things. He is a king over all the children of pride. But what really, how I see this connecting, where it talks about the scales are so close together that no air can go between them. This is the I guess you could say, these progressives and this progressive ideology. They push and push and push, and nothing. They leave nothing out. They've attacked everything that God has established for good, from gender, man and woman, to marriage, to, I mean, everything. We can go through the list.
The sanctity of life. I mean, we again, quickly, Joe, back to the $1.3 trillion Omnibus Bill. $500 million. Joe, more money than you, me, and think about this. Every listener joining us today on the Hagmann Daily Show will earn in their lifetime. in the stroke of a pen goes to Planned Parenthood, the baby butchery franchise in this country. One other quick point. At the beginning of what you read, it says, can we bore a hole through its jaw? Can we snare it with a hook? Now, some may argue, isn't that what we're attempting to do across the entire Hagmann Report platform? Because it's very easy sometimes to feel like we're fighting this massive monster. And keep in mind, colloquially, people interchange Leviathan with unbeatable monster in literature and in articles all the time. Now, are we trying to snare it with the hook or bore a hole through its jaw, which that scripture clearly indicates is folly, because Leviathan, its scales are packed too closely together. It cannot be smitten. Mm-hmm. But I would argue what we're doing is we're taking the time today to inform our listeners that whether it's an article by Richard Haas or the appointment of John Bolton or the signing of this bizarre budget that was definitely President Donald Trump's, I would say, worst moment thus far in office, politically far supersedes this Stormy Daniels ridiculousness, that this is Leviathan. And that's our job, that this leftist relativism is Leviathan.
Yeah, and I look at this as it's a what we see as far as the power structure, government, and it encompasses the agendas of what the government to the spiritual agenda of the evil is. And Matthew Henry, I love the commentary of Matthew Henry, and he writes so much on just about every Bible verse. He's got basically a page of commentary per verse. But what he talks about here is that that God has established. Obviously, he has a plan for everything, but we also need to understand that this Leviathan, as this Matthew Henry says, at first sight appears formidable, inaccessible. Who dares to come so near him while he is alive as to discover or take a distinct view of the face of the garment? But he goes on to talk about this is like a crocodile with the scales, and by what we said about them being so close together, he talks about how the evil, the satanic influences are constantly attacking us. And if we give in moments of weaknesses, and as Pastor Langford says, if Satan can't get to you, he'll do what? He'll get to those around you. And this is what the Leviathan is. It's a spirit of evil, and it is a constant attack trying to do what? Win a battle for the souls. That's what this battle is all about. It's about
question for you.
The soul.
Joe, question for agreed. When we saw President Donald Trump sign that bill and quip that he didn't like it, he looked right in the camera, I don't like it, but I've got to sign it. Was he bent over a barrel politically? Because we just argued last week that he's got an enormous political capital right now. Or was he trying to negotiate? Was he trying to institute the art of the deal, Joe, with the spirit of Leviathan?
Well, we said, and I do believe that President Trump does deserve a great deal of blame for signing the bill. At the same time, he, I understand why he did it, but I don't agree with doing it. And as my father pointed out, this is not a budget. This is an omnibus bill. And the difference, let me get the definition here. We did this last night. I want to be accurate. But the omnibus spending bill, the omnibus is a type of bill in the U.S. that packages many of the smaller regular appropriation bills into one larger single bill that can be passed with only one vote in each house. There are 12 different regular appropriation bills that need to be passed each year to fund the federal government and to avoid a government shutdown. An omnibus spending bill combines one or more of those bills into a single budget. So what essentially was passed, not a budget, it was a spending bill. Now, when they pass budgets, there are, as I just read, 12 separate appropriation bills that need to be passed. And instead of going, appropriation by appropriation, military spending, on and on and on, one by one, voting on it, what's necessary and what's not, they threw it all into one big omnibus bill. And the omnibus spending bills are obviously criticized for being full of unnecessary and wasteful spending. And we saw under President Obama that he did not pass a budget in his whole 8 years. He passed these omnibus bills.
He should have been impeached for that alone. He was clearly in dereliction of duty, but go ahead.
Well, that brings up another, is that an impeachable offense for President Trump? Because he is following along the footsteps of his predecessor. And this is not what we elected him to do, as we wanted a change from the status quo. And if I were the president, I would have vetoed the bill and made everybody sit down together and work the thing out piece by piece as to produce a budget. I mean, imagine, John, you and me, and I do a terrible job at this, but we have to budget. Otherwise, we get overdraft fees and we go into debt and we're broke all the time. How is it that the federal government, which is the biggest, everyone who works, your biggest expense is taxes? Before the mortgage, before healthcare, before all that stuff. At least mine is. And these people who take basically a third of everybody's paycheck every week can't even balance a budget. And we see headlines every quarter, record taxes taken this month. And then right after that, there's always another article. Government still, runs deficit of $70 billion amidst record tax income. It's insanity. And what they did here with the spending bill is just going to add to that insanity. And I don't know, John, what we see from the president is he has taken a lot of flack for this, and rightfully so. But more importantly, it is the Republican Congress, the Republican Senate, these same swamp monsters who, while Obama was in office, voted to repeal Obamacare 72 times. Now Trump, with a Republican House and Senate, can't get it done. That tells us all we need to know. And when Rand Paul is the only honest senator telling us like it is and what the problems with this bill are, all the other politicians are happy. Why? Because their district, their pockets are going to be lined with money. It doesn't affect them the way it affects us. Them passing a spending bill is equivalent to them getting bonuses. So they don't care about the rest of the people, but it is, and just to summarize this and bring it up about Leviathan, this is, they're feeding that system, and many people believe that the Leviathan is a sea creature. Others believe it is a government system. Either way, the Lord established everything for His purposes, and we see that the fall of man and the sinful nature is coming to a head. We will be redeemed one day, but just in closing with this Leviathan, this is the enemy we face. And when the Lord says, basically, you can't do anything to him because he'll devour you, doesn't leave a lot of hope in this world. And it kind of gives us a glimpse as to what we're going to face being Christians in this evil world until the Lord returns. So as Job says about Leviathan, lay your hand on him, but do no more. Remember the battle. But we'll have to talk more about this when I didn't plan on talking about this, so it's just
but it's actually produced some really off the cuff great content today, Joe. So again, my compliments on that. I think this is actually developed into a beautiful God shot show. But you made a very important distinction a moment ago, which is the difference between a spending bill and a budget. Now, anybody that runs a household knows that a budget is supposed to balance out at the end. A budget is supposed to be financial liabilities versus financial wherewithal, whether you're balancing your checkbook or writing out your family budget for the month. That's a budget. This is a criminal goulash. This is a bill that has such a massive identity crisis built into it that it funds the military, which is sold to the American public as projecting violent power around the world in defense, and I'm so sick of this verbiage, but in defense of American interests. You notice it's very rarely American lives. It's always American interest. Translate energy, the petrodollar, the economy, trade. It's very rare that American lives are on the line, but I digress. This bill funds an enormous amount of money. And Tracy Beans did a great video the other day that breaks this down for the four major branches of defense, et cetera, to guard American lives, and at the same time budgets $500 million to destroy the most defenseless American lives. And my concern, Joe, on a strictly pragmatic definition, is we're going into the midterms. You and I are going to be stuck ball and chained to reporting on impeachment. President Trump.
Know. You looking forward to that?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. Pass the Robitussin. So this is what we're looking at, and if the evangelical component of our electorate says, I've had it with Trump, Stormy Daniels, $500 million to Planned Parenthood, I'm done with this guy, and I've got a funny feeling, Joe, a lot of people out there are feeling that way, then we could see a Democratic takeover, the blue wave of vomit, come crashing into D.C., and guess what you're going to spend 2019 doing, listeners? You're going to spend 2019 debating whether you can stomach tuning into the Hagmann Daily Show as we parse through every odious level of impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I do believe that with the blue wave, with if certain people get into that House and get into that Senate and it becomes a Democratic majority without cause or reason, they will move to impeach President Trump, and they have stated as much that this is their plan. This is why it is so important that everybody get out and vote in these midterms, and not along political party lines, but instead voting for people on either side of the aisle who promise to continue to uphold the Constitution, and instead of working to try to undo something like the election of President Trump, they should be wanting to work to move forward and continue to make things better from that angle. And I mean, these people are stuck on stupid. They're still thinking that President Trump can be impeached and Hillary Clinton can be enthroned in her rightful place as king of the world. These people do not and will not let this go. Now, one thing, John, that I've been thinking about, which obviously such a blessing that Hillary Clinton did not become president. But think of this: when the next Democratic leader becomes president, it's going to be bad. It's going to be so bad. And what they've done to Trump, they've opened the door for the conservatives, when that next leader on the left comes in, to just go hog wild.
Well, what about this rank criminal Bush family that so many Fox News heads are still just so enamored with? Old W and his father, who was probably standing in Dealey Plaza the day that Kennedy got his head blown apart on television, but I digress. Yeah. This rank Bush family who went on record stating in 2016 that they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, keep in mind, this is the Hillary Clinton who was married to Bill Clinton, who unseated the only incumbent president in history who won a war and got sent home for it. Read my lips. No new taxes. And then she tried to, force national health care down our throats 30 years ago. But here's my point. We're in a situation right now. And this is, let me state for the record, this is my opinion. I take sole responsibility for the following comment. This is how mission critical the midterm elections are, listeners. If we don't protect the president by maintaining our majority on Capitol Hill, you will have violence and mayhem visited upon your city unless you live in the middle of P-Dunk nowhere. Because what will happen in 2019 is the right will become so disenfranchised with the political system in this country and with the attempt to unseat the president who was rightfully voted in by 62 million Americans, then violence will be visited upon our day-to-day lives. Now, I'm not promoting violence. Let me be clear. Joe Hagmann's not promoting violence. We're using our political analysis acumen over years of doing this now, Joe, a few more than I, to inform you that this will not be a peaceful exposition of power. If articles of impeachment are levied against President Donald Trump, there will be violence. So if for no other reason, Christian remnant, get out and support, even if it's the worst rhino candidate in town, make sure we hold those houses in November, because because frankly, the end game is not the demise of President Donald Trump. The end game is demise of our country.
Yeah, it is, and this is what they are moving towards, and it's not only that; it's the enslavement of the whole population. And I love, I'm glad I opened the Bible here. One of my favorite books in the Bible is Isaiah, because it so nicely prophesies and summarizes what is going on in our world. And I would even argue that what is written in Isaiah, meant for the time hundreds of years before Christ, is even more relevant today than ever. And in Isaiah 27, it talks about this Leviathan, but it also, and this is what I love about Isaiah, it goes through from chapter 27, Israel blossoms in the new kingdom, and it says this: in that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent. He shall lay the dragon that is in the sea. In that day sing ye unto her a vineyard of red wine. I, the Lord, do keep it. I will water it every moment, lest any hurt it. I will keep it night and day. And then he goes on to talk about bringing Israel back, and it says this: and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall beat off from the channel of the river unto the stream of Egypt, and ye shall be gathered one by one, O ye children of Israel. And it shall come to pass in that day that the great trumpet shall be blown, and they shall come which are ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and the outcasts in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mountain of Jerusalem. Now they're talking about the Israel becoming a nation again, and the day of the Lord. But what Isaiah goes on to say in chapter 29, which is titled Woe unto Ariel, and Ariel means Lion of God, or it's implied as Jerusalem, the city of David. It says the following: wherefore the Lord said, for so much as these people draw near to me with their mouth, and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of the wise men shall perish, and the understanding of the prudent men shall be hid. Woe to them that seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord, and their works are in the dark. And they say, who see us? Who knoweth us? Surely your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as the potter's clay. For shall the work say of him that made it, he made me not? Or shall the thing framed say of him that framed it, he framed me not? And it goes on from there, and it talks about the times that we live in today, and the burdens that are placed upon our society. And it goes on to talk about the end of the world. And again, I could go through the whole book of Isaiah. But either way, we see so much of this coming to fruition today. We see the secret societies. We see the evil satanic influence. We see the building up for the war, not only against God on earth and his people, but there is a spiritual battle that will manifest as a war in heaven. And we have been told about this in many different ways in the Old and New Testament, but I think it's so important. I've been doing a very in-depth study of Timothy, book 1 and book 2. There is so much in those books, at least as far as what to expect, how to live as a Christian, and what we need to do moving forward. And we're going to have to take some time, John, one of these shows. As this show, we really just flew off the handle here with this stuff, but I want to do a very in-depth study on Timothy, and you and me are going to talk about it off air, and we'll put it together to do a really good a show topic on this, because it deserves its own time. John, we're out of time. The show went by so fast.
I'm going to close on this. Proverbs 22 verses 2 and 3. The rich and poor meet together. The Lord is maker of them all. That's what's happening right now. Verse 3. A prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. Do not be the simple. That's I added that.
Amen. We're out of time. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening, everyone.
The Hagmann Daily Show is brought to you by the Hagmann Report. Tune in to the Hagmann Report weekdays, 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information, go to HagmannReport.com. That's HagmannReport.com.